Good morning. This is a live reading of Chapter 5 of the book The Tribulation Force. It is the second book in the series of the Left Behind books, and I will begin to read now. Chapter 5. Buck began to feel more confident that he wasn't in mortal danger. Too many people had been involved in getting him from Chicago to New York and now to Midtown. On the other hand, if Nikolai Carpathia could get away with murder in front of more than a dozen eyewitnesses, he could certainly eliminate one magazine writer. The limo eventually wound its way to the docks, where it stopped on the Circle Drive in front of the exclusive Manhattan Harbor Yacht Club. As the doorman approached, the chauffeur lowered the front passenger window and waved a finger at him, as if warning him to stay away from the car. Then the bodyguard got out, holding the car door, and Buck stepped into the sunshine. "Follow, please," the bodyguard said. Buck would have felt right at home in the yacht club, except that he was walking with a suited man who conspicuously guided him past a long line of patrons waiting for tables. The maitre d' glanced up and nodded as Buck followed his escort to the edge of the dining room. There, the man stopped and whispered, "You will dine with the gentleman in the booth by the window." Buck looked. Someone waved vigorously at him, drawing stares. Because the sun was to the man's back, Buck saw only the silhouette of a smallish, stooped man with wild wisps of hair. "I will be back for you at 1:30 sharp," the bodyguard said. "Don't leave the dining room without me." But the bodyguard slipped away, and Buck glanced at the maitre d', who ignored him. Still self-conscious, Buck made his way through the crowd of tables to the booth by the window, where he was exuberantly greeted by his old friend Chaim Rosenzweig. The man knew enough to whisper in public, but his enthusiasm was boundless. "Cameron," the Israeli exulted in his thick accent, "how good to see you. Sit down, sit down. This is a lovely place. No? Only the best for friends of the Secretary General. Will he be joining us, sir?" Rosenzweig looked surprised. "No, no, much too busy. Hardly ever able to get away. Entertaining heads of states, ambassadors, everyone wants a piece of him. I hardly see him more than 5 minutes a day myself." "How long will you be in town?" Buck asked, accepting a menu, allowing the waiter to drape a linen napkin on his lap. "Not much longer. By the end of this week, Nikolai and I are to finish preparations for his visit to Israel. What a glorious day it will be." "Tell me about it, doctor." I will, but first we must catch up." The old man suddenly grew serious and spoke in a somber voice. He reached across the table and covered Buck's hands with both of his. "Cameron, I am your friend. You must tell me straight out. How could you have missed such an important meeting? I am a scientist, yes, but I also consider myself somewhat of a diplomat. I worked hard behind the scenes with Nikolai and with your friend, Mr. Plank, to be sure you were invited. "I don't understand either," Buck said. What else could he say? Rosenzweig, creator of a formula that made the Israeli desert bloom like a greenhouse, had been his friend ever since Buck profiled him as Global Weekly's Newsmaker of the Year more than a year before. Rosenzweig was the one who had first mentioned the name Nikolai Carpathia to Buck. Carpathia had been a low-level politico from Romania who had asked for a private audience with Rosenzweig after the formula had been famous. Heads of state from all over the world had tried to curry favor with Israel to get access to the formula. Many countries sent diplomats to sweet-talk Rosenzweig himself when they got nowhere with the Israeli prime minister. Oddly, Carpathia was the one who most impressed Rosenzweig. He had arranged the visit himself and came on his own, and at the time he seemed to have no power to make any deals, even if Rosenzweig had been open to one. All Carpathia had sought from Rosenzweig was his goodwill, and he got it. Now Buck realized it was paying off. "Where are you?" Dr. Rosenzweig asked. "Where were you?" "That's the question of the ages," Buck said. "Where are any of us?" Rosenzweig's eyes twinkled through Buck. Though Buck felt like a fool, he was talking gibberish, but he didn't know what else to say. He couldn't tell the man, I was there, I saw the same thing you saw, but you were brainwashed by Carpathia because he's the Antichrist. Rosenzweig was a bright, quick man with a love for intrigue. So you don't want to tell me, all right, not being there was your loss. Of course, you were spared the horror it turned into. But what a historic meeting nonetheless. Get the salmon, you'll love it. Buck had always made it a habit to ignore recommendations in restaurants. It probably was one of the reasons for his nickname. He realized how rattled he was when he ordered what Rosenzweig suggested, and he loved it. Let me ask you something now, Dr. Rosenzweig. Please, please, Chaim. I can't call you Chaim, sir. A Nobel Prize winner. Please, you will honor me, please. All right, Chaim, Buck said, barely able to get the name out. Why am I here? What is this all about? The old man pulled a napkin from his lap, wiped his whole bearded face with it, balled it up, and plopped it onto his plate. He pushed the plate aside, sat back, and crossed his legs. Buck had seen people warm to a subject before, but never with as much relish as Chaim Rosenzweig. So the journalist in you comes out, hey, let me begin by telling you that this is your lucky day. Nikolai has in mind for you an honor that is such a privilege I cannot tell you. But you will tell me, won't you, sir? I will tell you what I have been instructed to tell you and no more. The rest will come from Nikolai himself. Rosenzweig glanced at his watch, a plastic banded $20 toy that seemed in, incongruous with his international status. Incongruous with his international status. Good, we have time. He has allotted 30 minutes for your visit, so please keep that in mind. I know you are friends and you may want to apologize for missing his meeting, but just remember that he has a lot to offer you and not much time to do it. He flies to Washington late this afternoon for a meeting with the president. By the way, the president offered to meet in New York, if you can imagine, but Nikolai, humbled as he is, would hear nothing of it. You find Carpathia humble? Probably as humble as any leader I have ever met, Cameron. Of course, I know many public servants and private people who are humble and have a right to be. But most politicians, heads of states, world leaders, they are full of themselves. Many of them have much to be proud of, and in many ways it is their egos that allow them to accomplish what they accomplish. But never have I seen a man like this. He's pretty impressive, Buck admitted. That's not the half of it, Dr. Rosenzweig insisted. Think about it, Cameron. He has not sought these positions. He rose from a low position in the Romanian government to become president of that nation when an election was not even scheduled. He resisted it. I'll bet, Buck thought. And when he was invited to speak at the United Nations not a month ago, he was so intimidated and felt so unworthy he almost declined. But you were there. You heard the speech. I would have nominated him for Prime Minister of Israel if I thought he would have taken it. Almost immediately, the Secretary General stepped down and insisted Nikolai replace him. And he was elected unanimously, enthusiastically, and he has been endorsed by nearly every head of state around the world. Cameron, he has ideas upon ideas. He is the consummate diplomat. He speaks so many languages that he hardly ever needs an interpreter, even for the chiefs of some of the remote tribes in South America and Africa. The other day, he shared a few phrases understood only by an Australian Aborigine. Let me just stop you for a second, Chaim, Buck said. You know, of course, that in exchange for stepping down from the Secretary Generalship of the UN, Nuego was promised access to your formula for use in Botswana. It wasn't quite so selfish and altruistic as it seemed. And, of course, Nikolai has told me all about that, but it was not part of any agreement. It was a gesture of his personal gratitude for what President Nuemo has done for the United Nations over the years. But how can he show his personal gratitude by giving away your formula, sir? No one else anywhere has access to it, and I was more than happy to offer it. You were? Buck's mind reeled. Was there no limit to Carpathia's persuasive power? The old man uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Cameron, it all ties together. This is part of why you're here. The agreement with the former General was an experiment, a model. I'm listening, Doctor. It's too early to tell, of course, but if the formula works as well as it has in Israel, Botswana will immediately become one of the most fertile countries in all of Africa, if not the world. Already, President Nuemo has seen his stature rise within his own nation. Everyone agrees he was distracted from his duties at the UN and that the world is better now for the new leadership. Buck shrugged, but apparently Rosenzweig didn't notice. And so Carpathia plans to do more of this brokering your formula for favors? No, no, you're missing the point. Yes, I have persuaded the Israeli government to license use of the formula to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Oh, shame for what? Billions of dollars that Israel no longer needs. It makes no sense. Having the formula made you the richest nation on earth for its size and solved myriad problems, but it was the exclusivity that made it work. Why do you think the Russians attacked you? They don't need your land. There's no oil to be found. They wanted the formula. Imagine if all the vast reaches of that nation were fertile. Dr. Rosenzweig held up a hand. I understand that, Cameron, but money has nothing to do with this. I need no money. Israeli needs no money. Then what could Carpathia offer that is worthy of the trade? What has Israel prayed for since the beginning of her existence, Cameron? And I'm not talking about her rebirth in 1948. From the beginning of time, as the chosen people of God, what have we prayed for? Buck's blood ran cold, and he could only sit there and nod. Rosenzweig answered his own question. Shalom, peace. Pray for the peace of Israel. We are a fragile, vulnerable land. We know God Almighty supernaturally protected us from the onslaught of the Russians. Do you know that there was so much death among their troops that the bodies had to be buried in a common grave, a crater gouged from our precious soil by one of their bombs, which God rendered harmless? We had to burn some of their bodies and bones, and the debris from their weapons of destruction was so massive that we have used it as a raw resource and are refabricating it into marketable goods. Cameron, he added ominously, so many of their planes crashed. Well, all of them, of course. They still had burnable fuel, enough that we estimated we would be able to use it for 5 to 8 more years. Can you see why peace is so attractive to us? Chain, you said yourself that God Almighty protected you. There could be no other explanation for what happened the night of that invasion. With God on your side, why do you need to barter with Carpathia for protection? Cameron, Cameron, Rosenzweig said wearily, history has shown our God to be capricious when it comes to our welfare. From the children of Israel wandering 40 years in the desert to the Six-Day War to the Russian invasion to now, we do not understand him. He lends us his favor when it suits his eternal plan, which we cannot comprehend. We pray, we seek him, we try to curry his favor. But in the meantime, we believe that God helps those who help themselves. You know, of course, that this is why you are here. I know nothing, Buck said. Well, it's part of why you're here. You understand that such an agreement takes a lot of homework. What agreement are we talking about? I'm sorry, Cameron. I thought you were following. You do not think it was easy, even for me, despite my stature within my own country, to persuade the powers to release a license to the formula, even to a man as attractive as Nikolai? Of course not. And you are right. Some of the meetings went long into the night, and every time I felt I had convinced someone, another was brought in. Every new ear had to be convinced. Many times I nearly gave up in despair, but finally, with many conditions, I was empowered to hammer out an arrangement with the United Nations. With Carpathia, you mean? Of course, make no mistake, he is the United Nations now. You got that right, Buck said. Part of the agreement is that I become part of his senior staff, an advisor. I will co chair the committee that decides whether formula will be licensed. And no money changes hands? None. And Israel gets protection from her neighbors from the United Nations. Oh, it is much more complex than that, Cameron. You see, the formula is now tied into Nikolai's global disarmament policy. Any nation even suspected of resisting the destruction of 90% of its weapons and the surrender of the remaining 10% to Nikolai, or I should say to the UN, will never be allowed to even be considered as an applicant for a license. Nikolai had pledged that he and I will be there to ensure this, of course. Will be more than judicious in licensing our nearest neighbors and most dangerous enemies. There has to be more than that. Oh, there is, but the crux of it is this, Cameron. Once the world has been disarmed, Israel should not have to worry about protecting her borders. That's naive. Not as naive as it might appear, because if there is one thing Nikolai Carpathia is not, it is naive. Knowing full well that some nations may hoard or hide weapons or produce new ones, the full agreement between the sovereign state of Israel and Security Council of the United Nations, with the personal signature of Nikolai Carpathia, makes a solemn promise. Any nation that threatens Israel will suffer immediate extinction using the full complement of weaponry available to the UN. With every country donating 10%, you can imagine the firepower. What I cannot imagine, Chaim, is an avowed pacifist, a rabid global disarmament proponent for his entire political career, threatening to blow countries off the face of the earth. It's only semantics, Cameron, Rosenzweig said. Nikolai is a pragmatist. There is a good bit of the idealist in him, of course, but he knows that the best way to keep the peace is to have the wherewithal to enforce it. And this agreement lasts for as long as we want it. We offered 10 years, but Nikolai said he would not require the freedom to license the formula for that long. He said he would ask for only 7 years, and then the full rights to the formula returned to us. Most generous, and if we want to renew the agreement every 7 years, we are free to do that too. You won't have any need for a peace treaty in 7 years, Buck thought. So what does this have to do with me, he asked. That's the best part, Rosenzweig said, at least for me, because it honors you. It is no secret that Nikolai is aware of your status as the most accomplished journalist in the world, and to prove that he bears no ill will for your snub of his last invitation, he is going to ask you to come to Israel for the signing of the treaty. Buck shook his head. I know it is overwhelming, Rosenzweig said. Rayford's plane hit the ground at O'Hare at 1 o'clock Chicago time. He called Chloe and got her voicemail. Yeah, Chloe, he said, I'm back earlier than I thought. Just wanted you to know that I'll be there within the hour. And suddenly Chloe beeped in. She sounded awful. Hi, Dad, she mumbled. You under the weather? No, just upset, Dad. Did you know that Buck Williams is living with someone? What? It's true, and they're engaged. I saw her. She was carrying boxes into his condo, a skinny little spike-haired girl in a short skirt. Maybe you had the wrong place. It was the right place. You're jumping to conclusions. Dad, listen to me. I was so mad I just drove around a while, then sat in the parking lot and cried. Then around noon, I went to see him at the Global Weekly office, and there she was, getting out of her car. I said, do you work here? And she said, yes. May I help you? And I said, I think I saw you earlier today. And she said, you might have. I was with my fiance. Is there someone here you need to see? I just turned and left, Dad. You didn't talk to Buck then? Are you kidding? I may never talk to him again. Just a minute. Someone's at the door. A minute later, Chloe came back on. I can't believe it. If he thinks this makes any difference. What? Flowers. And of course, they're anonymous. He had to have seen me driving by and knew how I feel. Unless you want these, you'll find them in the trash when you get home. After a few minutes after 2 in New York, Buck waited with Chaim Rosenzweig in an opulent waiting room outside the office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Chaim was merrily going on about something, and Buck pretended to pay attention. He was praying silently, not knowing if his foreboding sense of evil was psychological because he knew Nikolai Carpathia was nearby, or if the man truly emitted some sort of demonic aura detectable to followers of Christ. Buck was warmed by the knowledge that Bruce was praying for him right then, and he was having second thoughts about not informing Rayford and Chloe of his trip. His return ticket was for the 5 p.m. flight, so he knew he'd be back in time for the first of the 8 p.m. study sessions Bruce had planned. Buck looked forward to it already. He might even see if Chloe wanted to have a late dinner, just the two of them, before the meeting. So what do you think about that? Dr. Rosenzweig said. I'm so sorry, Dr. Buck said. My mind was elsewhere. Cameron, don't be nervous. Nikolai was upset, yes, but he has only good things in store for you. Buck shrugged and nodded. Anyway, I was saying, my dear friend, Rabbi Tyson ben Judah has finished his 3-year study, and it wouldn't surprise me if he wins a Nobel Prize for it. His 3-year study? You weren't listening at all, were you, my friend? I'm sorry. You must do better when you are with Nikolai. Promise me. I will. Forgive me. It's all right, but listen. Rabbi Ben Judah was commissioned by the Hebrew Institute of Biblical Research to do a 3-year study. A study of what? Something about the prophecies relating to Messiah, so we Jews will recognize him when he comes. Buck was stunned. The Messiah had come, and the Jews left behind had missed him. When he had come the first time, most did not recognize him. What should Buck say to his friend if he declared himself a tribulation saint, as Bruce liked to refer to new believers, since the rapture? What might he be doing to himself? Rosenzweig was a confidant of Carpathia's. Buck wanted to say that a legitimate study of the prophecies could lead only to Jesus, but he said only, what are the major prophecies pointing to the Messiah? To tell you the truth, Dr. Rosenzweig said, I don't know. I was not a religious Jew until God destroyed the Russian Air Force, and I can't say I'm devout now. I always took the messianic prophecies the way I took the rest of the Torah, symbolic. The rabbi at the temple I attended occasionally in Tel Aviv said himself that it was not important whether we believed that God was a literal being or just a concept. That fit with my humanist view of the world. Religious people, Jewish or otherwise, seldom impress me any more than the atheist with a good heart. Dr. Ben Judah was a student of mine 25 years ago. He was always an unabashed religious Jew Orthodox, but sort of a fundamentalist. Of course, he became a rabbi, but certainly not because of anything I taught him. I liked him and always have. He recently told me he had finished the study and that it was the most fulfilling and rewarding work he has ever done. Rosenzweig paused. I suppose you are wondering why I tell you this. Frankly, yes. I'm lobbying for a rabbi. Ben Judah's inclusion on Nikolai Carpathia's staff as spiritual advisor. He's looking for one. Not that he knows of, Rosenzweig said, roaring with laughter and slapping his knee. But so far he has trusted my judgment. That's why you're here. Buck lifted an eyebrow. I thought it was because Carpathia thinks I'm the best journalist in the world. Dr. Rosenzweig leaned forward and whispered spiritually. And what do you think he believes that? Why do you think he believes that? Rayford had had trouble reaching Chloe while driving, but he finally got through. Wondered if you wanted to go out with your old man tonight, he suggested, thinking she needed to be cheered up. I don't know, she said. I appreciate it, Dad, but we're going to Bruce's 8 o'clock meeting, aren't we? I'd like to, Rayford said. Let's stay in. I'm all right. I was just on the phone with Bruce. I wanted to know if he knew whether Buck was coming tonight. And He wasn't entirely sure. He hoped so. I hope not. Chloe! I'm just afraid of what I'll say, Dad. No wonder he's been cool toward me with that whatever you call her in his life. But the flowers, what was that all about? You don't even know they were from him. Oh, Dad, unless they were from you, they were from Buck. Rayford laughed. I wish I'd thought of it. So do I. Hattie Durham approached Buck and Chaim Rosenzweig as they both stood. Mr. Williams, she said, embracing him, I haven't seen you since I took this job. Yes, you have, Buck thought. You just don't remember. The Secretary General and Mr. Plank will see you now, she told Buck. She turned to Dr. Rosenzweig. Doctor, the Secretary General asked that you be prepared to join the meeting in about 25 minutes. Certainly, the old man said. He winked at Buck and squeezed his shoulder. Buck followed Hattie past several desks and down a mahogany appointed hallway, and he realized he had never seen her out of uniform. Today she wore a tailored suit that made her look like a classy, wealthy, sophisticated woman. The look only enhanced her stunning beauty. Even her speech seemed more cultured than he remembered. Her exposure to Nikolai Carpathia seemed to have improved her presence. Hattie tapped lightly on the office door and poked her head in. Mr. Secretary General and Mr. Plank, Cameron Williams of Global Weekly. Hattie pushed the door open and slipped away as Nikolai Carpathia advanced, reaching for Buck's hand with both of his. Buck seemed strangely calmed by the man and his smile. Buck, he said. May I call you Buck? You always have, Buck said. Come, sit. You and Steve know each other, of course. Buck was more struck with Steve's appearance than with Carpathia's. Nikolai had always dressed formally with perfectly coordinated accessories, suit coat buttoned, everything in place. But Steve, despite his position as executive editor of one of the most prestigious magazines in the world, had not always dressed the way you might expect a journalist to dress. He had always worn the obligatory suspenders and long sleeve shirts, of course, but he was usually seen with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, looking like a middle aged yuppie or an Ivy League student. Today, however, Steve looked like a clone of Carpathia. He carried a thin black leather portfolio and from head to toe looked as if he had come off the cover of a Fortune 500 edition of GQ. Even his hairstyle had a European flair, razor cut, blow dried, styled and moused. He wore new designer glasses, a charcoal suit just this side of pitch black, a white shirt with a collar pin, and tie that probably cost what he used to pay for a sports coat. The shoes were soft leather and looked Italian, and if Buck wasn't mistaken, there was a new diamond ring on Steve's right hand. Carpathia pulled an extra chair from his conference table, added it to the two before his desk, and sat with Buck and Steve. Right out of a management book, Buck thought. Break down the barrier between the superior and the subordinate. Yet, despite the attempt of an equal playing field, it was clear the intent of the meeting was to impress Buck, and he was impressed. Hattie and Steve had already changed enough to be nearly unrecognizable, and every time Buck looked at Carpathia's strong, angular features and quick, seemingly genuine, disarming smile, he wished with everything in him that the man was who he appeared to be and not who Buck knew him to be. He never forgot, never lost sight of the fact that he was in the presence of the slickest, most conniving personality in history. He only wished he knew someone as charming as Carpathia who was real. Buck felt for Steve, and yet he had not been consulted before Steve had left Global Weekly for Carpathia's staff. Now, much as Buck wanted to tell him about his newfound faith, he could trust no one. Unless Carpathia had the supernatural ability to know everything, Buck hoped and prayed he would not detect that Buck was an enemy agent within his camp. Let me begin with a humorous idiom, Carpathia said, and then we will excuse Steve and have a heart-to-heart, just you and me. Huh? Buck nodded. Something I have heard only since coming to this country is the phrase, the elephant in the room. Have you heard that phrase, Buck? You mean about people who get together and don't talk about the obvious, like the fact that one of them has just been diagnosed with a terminal illness? Exactly so. Let us talk about the elephant in the room and be done with it, and then we can move on. All right? Buck nodded again, his pulse increasing. I confess I was confused and a little hurt that you did not attend the private meeting where I installed the new ambassadors. However, as it turned out, it would have been as traumatic for you as it was for the rest of us. It was all Buck could do to keep from being sarcastic. One thing he could not and would not do was apologize. How could he say he was sorry for missing a meeting he had not missed? I wanted to be there and wouldn't have missed it for anything, Buck said. Carpathia seemed to look right through him and sat as if waiting for the rest of the thought. Frankly, Buck added, the whole day seems a blur to me now, a blur with vivid details he would never forget. Carpathia seemed to loosen up. His formal pose melted, and he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked from Buck to Steve and back. He looked peeved. So, all right, he said. Apparently, there is no excuse, no apology, no explanation. Buck glanced at Steve, who seemed to be trying to communicate with his eyes in a slight nod, as if to say something, Buck. Apologize. Explain. What can I say? Buck said. I feel badly about that day. That was as close as he would come to saying what they wanted him to say. Buck knew Steve was innocent. Steve truly believed Buck had not been there. Carpathia, of course, had masterminded and choreographed the whole charade. Acting upset that he wasn't getting an apology or an explanation was the perfect move, Buck thought. Clearly, Carpathia was fishing for some evidence that Buck knew what had happened. All Buck could do was play dumb and be evasive and pray that God would somehow blind Carpathia to the truth, that Buck was a believer and that he had been protected from susceptibility to Carpathia's power. All right, Carpathia said, sitting back and composing himself again. We all feel bad, do we not? I grieve the loss of two compatriots, one a dear friend of many years. Buck felt his stomach turn. Now, Buck, I want to talk to you as a journalist, and we will excuse our friend, Mr. Plank. Steve stood and patted Buck on the shoulder, leaving quietly. Buck became painfully aware that now it was just him and God sitting knee to knee with Carpathia. But it wasn't knee to knee for long. Nikolai suddenly rose and went back around his desk to the executive chair behind it. Just before he sat, he touched the intercom button, and Buck heard the door open behind him. Hattie Durham whispered, Excuse me, took the extra chair from in front of the desk and put it back at the conference table. As she was leaving, she adjusted and straightened the chair Steve had used. Just as quietly, she slipped out. Buck thought that very strange, this seemingly scripted arrangement of the entire meeting, from the formal announcement of his presence to the staging of who would be there and where they would sit. With the office now back to the way it was when Buck entered and Carpathia ensconced behind his massive desk, all pretense of equalizing the power base was gone. Yet Carpathia still had the charm turned all the way up. He intertwined his fingers and stared at Buck, smiling. Cameron Williams, he said slowly, how does it feel to be the most celebrated journalist of your time? What kind of question was that? It was precisely because Buck didn't ask such questions that he was a respected journalist. Right now, I'm just a demoted hack, he said. And humble besides, Carpathia said, grinning. In a moment, I am going to make clear to you that even though your stock may have fallen at Global Weekly, it has not fallen in the eyes of the rest of the world, and certainly not with me. I should have been more upset by your missing my meeting than your publisher was, and yet he overreacted. We can put these things behind us and move on. One mistake does not negate a lifetime of achievement. Carpathia paused as if he had expected Buck to respond. Buck was becoming more and more fond of silence. It seemed to be the right choice with Carpathia, and it certainly wasn't the way God had led him during the murderous meeting when Carpathia had polled everyone to assess what they had seen. Buck believed silence had saved his life. By the way, Carpathia said when it was clear Buck had nothing to say, do you have with you your cover story on the theories behind the vanishings? Buck couldn't hide his surprise. As a matter of fact, I do. Carpathia shrugged. Steve told me about it. I would love to see it. I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to show it to anyone until the weekly gets the final draft. Surely they have seen your working copy. Of course. Steve said you might want a quote or two from me. Frankly, unless you have something new, I think your views have already been so widely broadcast that they would be old to our readers. Carpathia looked hurt. I mean, Buck said, you still hold to the nuclear reaction with natural forces idea, right? That lightning may have triggered some spontaneous interaction between all the stockpiled nuclear weapons and, your friend Dr. Rosenzweig also subscribes to that theory. I understand that, yes, sir. But it will not be represented in your article? Sure it will. I thought the question was whether I needed a fresh quote from you. Unless your view has changed, I do not. Carpathia looked at his watch. As you know, I am on a tight schedule. Your trip was all right. Accommodations acceptable. A good lunch. Dr. Rosenzweig filled you in some. Buck nodded to every question. Assuming he told you about the UN treaty with Israel and that the signing will be a week from today in Jerusalem, let me extend a personal invitation to you to be there. I doubt the Weekly would send a Chicago staff writer to an international event of that magnitude. I am not asking that you join the press corps of thousands from around the world who will be seeking credentials as soon as the announcement is made. I am inviting you to be part of my delegation, to sit at the table with me. It will be a privilege no other media person in the world will have. Global Weekly has a policy that its journalists are not to accept any favors that might. Buck, Carpathia said, I am sorry to interrupt, but I will be very surprised if you are still an employee of Global Weekly a week from today. Very surprised. Buck raised his eyebrows and looked skeptically at Carpathia. Do you know something I don't know? And as soon as it was out of his mouth, Buck realized he had unintentionally asked the core question of this meeting. Carpathia laughed. I know of no plans to fire you, no. I think the punishment for your blown assignment has already been meted out. And though you turned down an offer of employment from me before, I truly believe I have an opportunity for you that will change your mind. Don't count on it, Buck thought, but he said, I'm listening. And that is the end of chapter 5, and we'll be reading chapter 6 next. Thank you for joining me, and you have a wonderful day. You're free to go.